I'm trying to do my best to stay alive as long as possible and not die for bodybuilding. Again, I love bodybuilding, but I'm not willing to die for it. Vigorous Steve here. I need you guys to understand something perfectly. Bodybuilding and longevity are basically the polar opposite. Everything that we do in bodybuilding, whether you're drug-free or enhanced, will inevitably shorten your lifespan. Now, how much of a life-shortening effect you will get from your bodybuilding aspirations is entirely up to you. You can shorten your life with years or decades if you're very extreme and you do a lot of self-experimentation and take dosages which are completely unnecessary, or you could maybe shorten your life with only 1 day or maybe a minute, depending on what you're doing with your body, the restrictions you place upon yourself while you're trying to reach your goals. And that maybe means that you'll never reach your goals, so you'll have to settle for less because you don't want to trade your bodybuilding aspirations against your longevity so you can have a normal outcome of life and enjoy the quality of life when you're older, in your 60s, 70s, 80s, or maybe even 90s. But before we get into all of that, please like the video, leave a comment for the algorithm, and consider joining the Vigorous crew by subscribing and hitting the notification bell button so you can get notified every time a new video drops. And I'm sure we're all familiar with bodybuilding and what we need to do to reach our bodybuilding goals, so let's not waste any time there. Let's talk about longevity. Again, it's the polar opposite of bodybuilding because for longevity, you need to restrict your calories. Caloric restriction has been shown to extend life. And whether that's 1,500 calories per day or 2,000 calories per day, the baseline accepted ranges of calories is about 2,500. And again, it highly depends on how many micronutrients and other nutrients you're getting for those 2,500 calories. So the more of a caloric restrictive state that you're in, especially if you're doing intermittent fasting, that has been shown to increase the duration of life and improve longevity parameters. Now again, full fasting has also been shown to increase longevity because now you're in such a severe caloric restrictive state that you're actually inducing autophagy. Now as a bodybuilder, many guys are against autophagy or against fasting because you're going to lose all of your gains. I think I've pretty much debunked that over the last couple of years. I think I was the first bodybuilder to show that you can fast for a week or longer and not lose any strength or size. Now, a lot of people have not catched on to this. There are several coaches out there which recommend 1 day of fasting after a refeed, especially during a contest prep or cutting phase, where you would refeed on Sunday, right? A surplus of calories and definitely a surplus of carbohydrates to reglycogenate the muscle, and then maybe fast on Monday so you can get back into ketosis, get back into a fat burning state. And that's pretty much the longest any bodybuilder could tolerate. Now, what I've been doing for the last couple of years is a quarterly fast every 3 months for about 5.5 days. I would stop eating Sunday evening. Again, I would have my refeed during that time. Then Monday to Saturday morning, I would fast, do my blood work, see what blood work parameters have improved, and then continue with eating. Again, I don't lose any muscle that way, but if you're hesitant to do that, you might simply want to restrict calories for certain months out of the year while you're off cycle. This way you can get lean, improve your insulin sensitivity, and do some sort of damage control for the lifespan shortening that you've undergone while being on cycle and eating a surplus of calories. Right? Will you be able to mitigate and undo all of the damage that you've done on cycle? Probably not. You can simply postpone the inevitable. Again, postponing the inevitable is what longevity is all about. Caloric restriction in this sense is key. Now, when you're in the off season, you're in a caloric surplus state for months on end, maybe even a year. We have the term perma-bulker for a reason. So doing the whole act of bodybuilding where you're eating a ton of food to gain all of this muscle tissue, again, that in itself, that alone will detract from your lifespan. Again, it's a huge trade-off, right? You want to reach your goals and get freaky huge and muscular, but the chronic intake of calories and particular micronutrients, again, might detract from your health in the long term. Now, protein intake is part of that. It's still a bit undecided how much of an effect protein intake has on your kidney health. I believe the most recent consensus is that high protein intake does not have a negative effect on your health. But again, a lot of protein intake might worsen other health parameters in the long run. That's why you see in caloric restriction and reduced protein intake that longevity is sustained longer. Again, these are mostly rodent models. Now, how much of that we can translate into something that we can use practically as human beings, I wasn't able to find any conclusive evidence that prolonged protein restriction actually improves the lifespan of humans, but it has been shown that protein restriction in cases of chronic kidney disease, certain cancers, osteoporosis, and liver disease might actually improve that particular condition. So that's something to keep in mind. Will high protein intake detract from your health or kill you faster? Probably not, but it will certainly not contribute to improving longevity and increasing your lifespan. Again, there's a lot of evidence and studies that still need to be performed for that to become conclusive, so you can use that in a practical sense. I think the caloric intake is more important than the overall protein intake when it comes to managing your longevity. Still, it's just something you need to keep into consideration. What I would be more worried about, what's more concerning, is the shortening of telomeres. For longevity, you want to keep your telomeres, which is the end of the DNA, which shortens as DNA replicates in self-proliferation. As the DNA shortens, the telomeres get less and less and less. And when the telomeres disappear, the DNA actually gets impaired. The ends of the DNA can no longer transcribe into RNA and produce the proteins that are needed for normal bodily functioning. So as the cell proliferates, the DNA gets shorter. And when the DNA gets very short, the cell can no longer function correctly, turning into a senescent cell. This is a normal part of aging. So you have an enzyme called telomerase, which you can upregulate the activity of telomerase with a peptide like epithalon or other experimental peptides, which have been shown to increase telomerase length. Astragalus root extract has been shown to increase telomerase activity. So those might be able to protect against the shortening of telomeres. Now with bodybuilding, we want a lot of cell proliferation resulting in hyperplasia. Again, hypertrophy is the thickening and growing of the muscle cell, and hyperplasia is the division, the cell proliferation of the muscle cell, turning one muscle cell into two muscle cells, which you can then stimulate with a hypertrophy response, making it thicker. Right? This is how the muscle grows. But in cell proliferation, the telomeres shorten. Unfortunately, the cell proliferation that we want in bodybuilding, you might not be able to mitigate this shortening of telomeres. It's a huge trade-off. Again, you want the lowest amount of cell proliferation by suppressing your IGF-1 and other growth factors in the body if you solely live for longevity, preventing the shortening of telomeres and getting senescent cells later on in life. And with bodybuilding, we're probably speeding up that entire process. So maybe the act of bodybuilding and all this oxidative stress that comes along with strenuous hypertrophy workouts, especially when you're using anabolic androgenic steroids, the oxidative stress, the DNA damage that can potentiate, the shortening of telomeres through a lot of hyperplasia and cell proliferation activity, that might really detract from your lifespan. So, and whether you take performance-enhancing drugs or not, even drug-free athletes produce a lot of reactive oxygen species when they train for hypertrophy. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other things that go into longevity, but otherwise this video would be way too long. I'm trying to keep it YouTube algorithm friendly. Have a look at David Sinclair's podcast. He talks about longevity all the freaking time. There's a very good source of information. I'll link it down below. I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with David Sinclair's podcast. And it's all about longevity. And once you start to follow this podcast more frequently, you basically understand that everything we do in bodybuilding is almost the polar opposite. So the way I always looked at it is that the act of bodybuilding, especially when you take performance-enhancing drugs, is compressing your life. So instead of 90 years with an average quality of your life, now you might get 80 years with a higher quality of life. Now, ideally, the things that we do right now for our bodybuilding aspirations will not detract from our life later on when we've given up bodybuilding, or maybe put bodybuilding on the back burner. I already made several videos about that. I'll link it at the end of this one. The way I look at it is that I'm compressing my life actively. And in the beginning, when I started my bodybuilding journey, I didn't think about this. Then you get older, you do more research, you start to understand that you're putting a lot of strain on your body and particular organs more than others. The kidneys, for example, through high blood pressure. And we can make a separate video about this and to talk for hours about all the organ stress that we potentiate for the sake of bodybuilding. You're literally compressing your life. And as you get older, you start to get more and more concerned because you're reaching the end of your lifespan. In your 20s, you might not really think about this, and neither did I. But as you get older, When you're 30, you get a little bit more conservative. Especially when you're 40 or reaching close to 40, you start to think about all of the mistakes that you made in the past and what damage you might have done to your body. Then you start to look into the anti-aging, try to undo some of this damage with NAD plus or injectable glutathione or hyperbaric chamber therapy, right? A lot of different things you can do to improve longevity and maybe mitigate some of the damage that you've done in your 20s or 30s when you were able to tolerate a lot more abuse or poor decisions regarding your bodybuilding aspirations. And then I'm sure when you're 50 or 60, you already start to regret some of the things that you did, but hopefully you're financially secure enough to at least prolong the inevitable. Now, what we see nowadays a lot in the bodybuilding space, people who are very inconsiderate about longevity, they do very extreme experiments for the sake of figuring out a higher truth, or because they want to turn pro super, super fast and compete at the highest level, is that they pay the ultimate price, right? They compress probably a lifetime worth of drug use into a decade. And this is where the deaths are ultimately coming from. If you are able to use performance-enhancing drugs moderately, do periods of caloric restriction, not do crazy experiments like I've done in the past, and I'm actively trying to warn you guys about. And a lot of the stuff that I did in the past is completely unnecessary. And maybe even some of the experiments that I'm doing right now are unnecessary, but I'm taking a lot more moderate approach to the experiments that I'm doing currently, right? And I'm taking my breaks here and there to improve my blood work parameters and doing all of the organ imaging and blood work on a monthly basis just to make sure I'm staying on the path. So the people who are not doing that, they push their head in the sand and only care about bodybuilding, again, they pay the ultimate price. And it's very unfortunate, but it's just something everybody needs to realize. The more extreme you get in this bodybuilding space, the shorter your life will be. And you can look into your genetic makeup, see if you're predispositioned to particular medical issues later on in life. But unfortunately for us, we love bodybuilding so much that many of us consider this a worthy trade-off. And whether that's 1 day less, 1 year less, or maybe even a decade less, right now, a lot of us are finding this to be a worthy trade-off. Will we feel the same way when we're reaching the end of our lifespan? Probably not. So what I want everybody to do, and what I've been doing for the last couple of years now, is I look at these experiments or bodybuilding in the following way. Is extreme bodybuilding and the experiment that I'm running at this moment, is it worth shortening my life over? Now, can we estimate how much of a life-shortening effect each experiment will have? And if you're running a particular peptide or a higher dosage, or doing a very high caloric diet for a year on end, it's very hard to quantify, but you have to keep it in the back of your head that everything compounds. The drugs, the food, the strenuous training, and the organ stress and the connective tissue stress and the potential for muscle tears or hair loss or acne scars or gynecomastia. I think a lot of us in the moment, we think it's worth it. Maybe later on in life, we don't find it worth it. So we have to consider in the moment whether a particular experiment, drug, training, food intake, supplement is worth shortening our life for or not. In my opinion, and I say this with the utmost respect for the audience, myself and my wife, as soon as you have kids, you no longer find this trade-off to be worthy. When you have kids, you're supposed to raise them, and it takes years, decades. So while you're trading your bodybuilding aspirations for longevity, that's fine, right? You might consider that to be a worthy trade-off in the moment, but as soon as you have kids, you're supposed to be there to raise your kids and see this project through all the way to the end. You want to make sure that they're taken care of. You want to make sure that they have a better outcome in life than you had and prevent all of the mistakes that your parents made while raising your own kids. Again, that's the way I look at it. Maybe you don't look at it the same way. But really, man, when I have kids, maybe a year or two from now, I'm going to leave a lot of this bodybuilding, especially extreme bodybuilding and the experimentation behind. And everything that I'm doing right now is just to make sure that I'm not doing any further damage than all of the mistakes that I did previously when I wasn't as educated and knowledgeable as I am right now. Again, prevention is the best cure. Longevity is something you keep in the back of your head while actively pursuing bodybuilding. But when that bodybuilding door is closed, you've built all of the mass and you realize you don't need to do so much to sustain the mass that you've built. You have kids, you close that chapter, you train to maintain, and you live for longevity because you want to see your kids grow up. I'll leave it at that. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find everything that I'm associated with down below in the YouTube description section. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok at VigorSteve. A front double bicep for the Vigorous crew. A little bit of longevity in these cannons, but I'm trying to do my best to stay alive as long as possible and not die for bodybuilding. Again, I love bodybuilding, but I'm not willing to die for it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.